What is truth, and who gets to define it? This question lingered in the air when Meghan Markle sat down with veteran journalist Gayle King in a CBS studio, turning what seemed like a routine morning show interview into a tense and memorable exchange. At first glance, everything unfolded by the book. The studio's familiar orange and blue backdrop glowing warmly, cameras gliding across polished floors, and Gayle, elegant and composed, greeting her guest with her trademark poise. Meghan appeared equally prepared, dressed sharply in a navy blazer and cream blouse, her calm posture signalling confidence and control. Viewers might have expected a polished promotional segment about her new philanthropic initiative. Gayle opened gently. "Meghan, thank you for joining us. Our audience is eager to hear about your new project." Meghan responded smoothly, outlining her campaign to raise global awareness of overlooked social issues. Her words, carefully delivered, emphasized compassion and responsibility. For a moment, the mood was uplifting, hopeful, exactly what the producers might have envisioned. But seasoned viewers know that Gayle King rarely stays at the surface. Without raising her voice, she leaned forward slightly, her questions shifting into more probing territory. That's when the atmosphere began to change. The first challenge came swiftly. "You've spoken about your personal truth, but some have noted inconsistencies. For instance, when you told Oprah that you and Prince Harry held a private wedding ceremony before the official one, the Archbishop later denied this. How do you reconcile that difference?" The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. Meghan's polished smile tightened. She adjusted her blazer sleeve before answering, her voice now edged with steel. "It's fascinating that people obsess over technicalities instead of the emotional truth. What Harry and I experienced was sacred. Others can choose to nitpick, but that doesn't erase our reality." Gayle acknowledged the point with a measured nod, but pushed back. "Some might argue truth should be universal, not just personal, especially when shared on such a public platform." A brief, dismissive laugh slipped from Meghan. "With all due respect, Gayle, you weren't there. Neither was the Archbishop in every private moment of our lives. Commenting from the outside is easy, but you didn't live it." The shift was unmistakable. The audience, once nodding politely, grew uneasy. The early atmosphere of polite pleasantries was giving way to something sharper, almost confrontational. Gayle's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm as she introduced another point of contention. "You've said you received no media training before entering royal life, yet palace insiders have claimed otherwise. Would you say they're lying?" And with that, the polite morning chat had evolved into one of the most charged interviews CBS had staged in recent memory, raising questions not only about Meghan's words, but about the very nature of truth, memory, and perception in public life. Why this works, Meghan no longer bothered with polite smiles. Her expression sharpened as she repeated Gayle's reference to palace insiders with a flicker of disdain. "Anonymous voices protecting a crumbling institution," she said coolly. "Forgive me if I don't lend weight to their stories. I lived it. I know the truth." It was a striking moment. Instead of offering careful explanations, Meghan's tone carried an air of dismissal, placing herself above scrutiny, brushing aside questions as though they were unworthy of her time. Gayle, seasoned by decades in television, kept her face neutral. Yet, behind the calm exterior, she felt the first real crackle of tension. The audience sensed it too. The polite applause of earlier segments had faded. Silence filled the studio, heavy and expectant. Still, Gayle pressed forward. She adjusted her notes, her steady hand belying the shifting mood. Meghan leaned back in her chair, chin tilted just enough to suggest defiance. The conversation had clearly left the realm of philanthropy. What remained was a test of endurance, one woman's insistence on her narrative against another's quiet determination to hold her accountable. Gayle's next question was deliberate, almost delicate in delivery. "In your interview with Oprah, you described feeling isolated during your pregnancy and said you were denied mental health support. Yet, former palace staff claimed that resources were available. How do you respond to that?" Meghan's smile returned, but it was tinged with ice. Gayle, it's very easy for people to rewrite history when they weren't the ones living it. I was there. I was the one left to suffer. If others claim otherwise, perhaps they're more concerned with protecting the monarchy than with telling the truth. Her voice was smooth, but the sweetness carried a sting. The studio's air seemed to tighten. Gayle nodded, refusing to flinch. I understand, but when multiple accounts exist, people will naturally question accuracy. Don't you think consistency matters? The response came with a sharp, almost mocking laugh. Consistency? The only consistent thing has been the smear campaign against me. I've endured lies, distortions, half-truths for years, and now I'm expected to justify myself against nameless sources? That's laughable. Maybe they should spend less time whispering to reporters and more time reflecting on their own failures. Her words struck like arrows, blunt, unapologetic, and searing. The audience stirred uncomfortably, some shifting in their seats. Viewers tuning in expecting polished sound bites instead witnessed raw defiance. Meghan's tone dripped with contempt, as if scolding the very notion of accountability. Gayle inhaled slowly, the embodiment of composure under pressure, but Meghan's steady dismissal pressed against her patience, tightening the studio's atmosphere with every pointed remark. Gayle King shifted her note cards ever so slightly, a subtle pause to gather composure before moving into her next question. Her voice, still calm but edged with firmness, carried the weight of years in journalism. You've often said stepping back from royal life was about privacy. Yet, since then, you've released memoirs, documentaries, and sat for multiple high-profile interviews. How do you reconcile the desire for privacy with such a public presence? The question cut through the studio's tension like a blade. Meghan's smile hardened into something cool, almost glacial. Privacy, she answered, her tone dripping with disdain, does not mean silence. Privacy means choice, choosing what to share and what to protect. Just because I refuse to be silenced by the palace or the media does not mean I've surrendered my right to privacy. Frankly, I find your question insulting. The audience shifted uneasily. What had begun as a feature on philanthropy was now an unmistakable confrontation. Meghan wasn't merely defending her position, she was attacking the very premise of the question. Gayle's head tilted slightly, her voice even but tinged with steel. I don't mean to offend, Meghan. I'm simply trying to understand the balance you're describing. The response came like a whip crack. Then perhaps you should try harder, Gayle, because to suggest that my husband and I don't deserve to tell our story is absurd. The very fact that I'm forced to explain this shows how deep the bias still runs. Gasps rippled through the audience. For the first time, a faint flicker crossed Gayle's composed expression, a tiny crack in her otherwise serene mask. But she pressed on, hands clasped calmly. I hear you, but you must also understand that these aren't just palace criticisms. These are genuine questions viewers have. They want clarity. Meghan leaned forward, her voice heavy with superiority, posture almost regal. And maybe the public should stop expecting me to spoon-feed answers to every petty doubt. My life is not a courtroom drama. I don't owe palace staff, critics, or even viewers an explanation for my choices. The words landed with a thud, sharp enough to rattle the studio. In the control room, producers hesitated, fingers hovering over the button to cut to commercial. But they knew better. This was the kind of unscripted television moment that electrifies an audience. Gayle adjusted her glasses, her voice steady but edged with authority. I respect your view, but when you make strong public statements that shape how millions perceive one of the world's oldest institutions, people are going to ask questions. That's not bias. That's journalism. Meghan tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk. And I respect that you think this is journalism, Gayle, but let's be honest, this isn't about truth. It's about entertainment, and if a spectacle is what you wanted, well, congratulations, you have it. The audience audibly gasped. Silence followed, heavy and charged. Gayle's outward calm remained intact, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her thinning patience. She had interviewed presidents and survivors, world leaders and cultural icons, yet rarely had she endured such open condescension on her own stage. Still, she did not yield. "We're here for an honest conversation, Meghan. That's all." Meghan folded her arms, her smirk unwavering. "Then, perhaps you should learn to ask honest questions instead of recycling palace spin." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Gayle's composure held, but the tension was undeniable. The cracks in her calm exterior were no longer hidden. Viewers at home could sense it. The audience in the studio shifted restlessly. The clash had reached a new level. Meghan standing firm in her defiance, Gayle straining to keep the storm from breaking completely. The atmosphere inside the CBS studio had shifted into something taut, almost brittle. Each time Gayle King posed a question, her tone remained steady, soft-spoken, professional, even careful. Yet, Meghan Markle's answers cut back like blades, sharp and dismissive, leaving no room for warmth. What should have felt like an interview began to resemble a battle, one where Meghan refused to engage on equal footing, brushing aside every prompt as though it were beneath her. Gayle's years of experience carried her through moments that might rattle others. She had challenged heads of state and confronted CEOs under fire. But this exchange was different. Meghan's demeanour, aloof, scornful, uncompromising, tested her patience more than any politician ever had. With deliberate calm, Gayle tried to steer the conversation toward common ground. "You've spoken about service many times. Since stepping away from the monarchy, how do you define that now?" Meghan let out a clipped laugh, shaking her head as though weary of having to explain herself. "Service isn't about titles or positions. It's about the impact you create. The fact that people still expect me to define something so obvious says more about society than it does about me." Her arms folded tightly across her chest, her chin tilted upward, body language signalling a wall more than an invitation. Gayle acknowledged the response, but pressed gently. "I understand, but some argue that much of your recent work, your book, the documentaries, these interviews, seems focused on your personal journey rather than community service. What would you say to them?" A smirk flickered across Meghan's face. "Perception is shaped by prejudice. People who have already decided to see me as self-serving won't acknowledge my efforts. Correcting their ignorance is not my responsibility." The remark drew an audible stir from the audience. The tension in the room deepened, every word landing with the weight of accusation. Undeterred, Gayle adjusted her note cards and asked, "Let's focus on your latest project. How does it expand on or differ from the work you've done before?" Meghan flicked her hand dismissively, almost as though brushing away an insect. "It's not about reinventing anything. It's about building on the foundation I've already established. Frankly, repeating myself feels unnecessary. My achievements are already public record." The reaction from the audience was immediate. A quiet but unmistakable gasp. Meghan's tone hadn't just dismissed the question, it seemed to dismiss Gayle herself. For a long moment, Gayle said nothing, choosing instead to steady her breath before continuing. "Meghan," she said finally, voice still calm though her eyes had hardened, "our viewers value specifics. They want to know not just what you're doing, but the purpose behind it. Could you give us an example?" Meghan's eyes rolled ever so slightly, but the cameras caught it. "With all respect, Gayle, I didn't come here to recite talking points. If people genuinely want information, it's available online. I don't need to spoon-feed details to anyone." This time, the audience's reaction was louder, shocked whispers cutting through the silence. Gayle's grip tightened around her cards, though her tone stayed composed. "I see. But when someone appears on national television, many expect transparency. That, too, is part of accountability." Meghan leaned forward, her gaze narrowing, her words sharp. "Accountability? Since the day I married into that family, I've been subjected to endless scrutiny, far more than most could bear. Forgive me if I don't feel obligated to bend to critics who will never support me." The words hung in the air like a spark in a room filled with fuel. Gayle straightened in her chair, the cracks in her patience beginning to show. "Meghan," she said firmly, "I am not here as a critic. I am here to do my job. My audience expects me to ask questions that matter. And I have to say, the way you've responded today may make it difficult for people to believe in the sincerity of your message." Meghan laughed again, a short, cold sound that froze the room. The silence inside the studio had become unbearable. Every word felt like a spark tossed into dry grass. Meghan Markle leaned back in her chair, arms folded, chin raised, her gaze cool and unyielding. Gayle King, usually the picture of warmth and patience, set her note cards down with deliberate calm. The interview had turned into a standoff, and the weight of it pressed on everyone watching. "Perhaps sincerity makes people uneasy, Gayle," Meghan said with a pointed smirk. "Maybe you and your viewers simply aren't prepared for someone who refuses to play by the usual rules." Gasps echoed softly through the crowd. Some faces reflected sympathy for Gayle, others were stunned by Meghan's audacity. For the first time, Gayle lifted her eyes directly to her guest, letting irritation flash openly across her face. Her tone hardened. "Meghan, no one here is asking you to play a game," she replied evenly. "What's being asked for is respect. Respect for the questions, for the audience, and for this platform you chose to use." The room stilled. Meghan's smile widened into a taunt. "Respect works both ways, Gayle." The tension was like static electricity, so heavy it seemed the air itself might snap. Gayle remained motionless, her fingers interlaced on the table, but the fire in her eyes showed the edge of her patience. She had given empathy, she had shown restraint, but the facade of morning show civility was fracturing. Leaning forward now, her voice stripped of its earlier gentleness, Gayle pressed on. "Meghan, you've said again and again that you feel misunderstood, even attacked. But let me be clear. What you've shown today isn't strength. It's arrogance." The studio collectively inhaled. Meghan blinked, visibly shaken. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her voice sharp. Gayle did not waver. "You've brushed off every question, rolled your eyes at accountability, and suggested that people who don't agree with you are ignorant. That is not the voice of a leader. That is not how change is built. It's the voice of someone acting entitled." The words dropped like stones into water, rippling across the room. Meghan's lips trembled. Her hand clutched the armrest, knuckles pale. "How dare you?" she began, but Gayle cut her off with a flash of finality. "No, Meghan, how dare you? How dare you sit here, ask for airtime, and then belittle the very people you claim you want to uplift? How dare you frame every attempt at accountability as some grand conspiracy? The truth is, you've been handed platforms most people can't imagine, and yet you treat them with disdain." Meghan's cheeks flushed crimson, her composure faltering. Her eyes glistened, and she fought to maintain her poise. Gayle pressed harder, her voice rising with conviction. "You rail against the monarchy, yet cling to the title that comes with it. You speak of service, yet every project circles back to your personal narrative. And let's be honest, if you had not married Prince Harry, none of this attention would exist." The audience erupted in shocked murmurs. Meghan's breath hitched. She sat frozen as Gayle rose slightly from her chair, her voice resonating with authority. "You behave as though the palace is still behind you, as though the world owes you deference. But you're not in the palace anymore. You are not exempt from accountability. And sitting here today, you're not presenting yourself as a duchess. You're coming across as someone stamping her feet when the world doesn't bend to her will." Tears welled in Meghan's eyes. She turned slightly, as though shielding her face from the cameras. "You don't understand," she whispered. Gayle's response cut through the tension like glass. "Oh, I understand perfectly. This is no longer about race or tradition or mental health. This, Meghan, is about envy." The room went silent. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would be replayed for years to come. Gayle's voice dropped to a level of icy precision. "This isn't about bias or privacy. This is about envy. You wanted what William and Kate have, the admiration, the stature, the spotlight. And when you realized it wasn't yours to take, you chose to tear the whole house down on your way out. The words hit like a thunderclap. Meghan gasped, a sob escaping her lips. For the first time, the carefully constructed armor she had worn throughout the interview shattered. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pushed back her chair, the harsh scrape echoing across the silent studio. This is unacceptable, she cried, her voice breaking. I don't have to sit here and endure this. Gayle stood her ground, unflinching. Then don't. If you can't answer the questions people are already asking, perhaps you shouldn't be here. Don't claim service when every answer shows you're serving only yourself. Meghan snatched her purse, her shoulders trembling as she turned for the exit. Every camera followed her as she walked away, heels striking the polished floor with heavy finality. The audience sat frozen, watching in disbelief as the Duchess left the stage in tears. When the door shut behind her, the silence broke into a low roar of whispers. Some viewers in the studio exchanged looks of shock, others nodded in admiration toward Gayle. No one could deny they had witnessed something extraordinary. Gayle turned back to the cameras, her voice once again steady, authoritative. This is live television. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it still matters. The director signalled for a commercial break, but the damage, and the legacy, had already been cemented. Meghan Markle had come to shine a spotlight on her newest cause. Instead, she walked away in tears, her polished image fractured before millions of eyes. Gayle King, who had given patience and space until it could no longer hold, had voiced what so many viewers had been thinking. What began as a morning show interview had ended as one of the most unforgettable confrontations in modern television.